So, that was a little burst of it, but was there a coherent vision in there for how the government might achieve some of those aims? And was the policy menu broad enough to keep Southern Tories happy while also meeting the concerns of their newer Red Wall allies in the Midlands and the North? Professor Matthew Goodwin is an academic and author whose recent work has focused on populism and the realignment of British politics after Brexit. And Ryan Shorthouse is the founder and chief executive of Bright Blue, which calls itself an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. Welcome to you both. Ryan Shorthouse, 38 bills and draft bills. Is quantity, do you think, an indication of quality?
Well, I think it's certainly an extensive agenda. And of course, the thing to remember is that some bills that have been long promised in previous Queen's speeches, for example, around mental health and on planning, have found their way into this Queen's speech as well. So some of it is sort of taking over putting in again because it sort of expired in previous sessions. But no, to answer your question, I don't think it's necessarily indicative of quality. I think there's a lot of potential, particularly around levelling up and achieving net zero by 2050, which are the sort of main domestic agendas of the government. But really, the devil will be in the detail. There's a potential here for Boris to be bold in the middle of this parliament. This is almost his final attempt, but it depends on whether the government takes the chance to deliver distinctive and transformational policies within these bills, or actually they sort of go for more of the politicking, which, considering we're sort of a year or maybe 2 years away from an election, they sort of look for dividing lines on cultural war issues, or actually they deliver something substantial, radical, distinctive.
Matthew Goodwin, is there the potential to be bold? Sir Keir Starmer said he thought the speech was bereft of ideas and without a guiding principle.
Well, I think you could certainly argue that Johnson is lacking a sort of foundational principle, that there isn't really much of a philosophy behind the legislation that we've seen put forward. But having said that, in a sense, Brexit was the big idea. Brexit was the challenge to the zeitgeist, and there's lots that's come out today that you can see featuring in the next general election campaign. Johnson has to hold together this very awkward coalition between the more working class, non-graduate areas in the North and the Midlands and the more graduate, middle class, professional, liberal areas on the outskirts of London. And you can see in this Queen's speech how he's going to do that. I think you've got the levelling up stuff, you've got the Brexit dividend stuff, the divergence from the EU, you've got the illegal migration, strengthening the borders stuff, and you've got some free speech issues and online protection and so on, which I think will also feed into that. So where we're heading, I suspect, is a reboot of the 2019 general election strategy, levelling up, Brexit, migration, and that's how he plans to, I think, try and stay in power.
But as you've pointed out, this is a broad coalition, voters with perhaps quite different demands and needs that they're trying to hold together. If you see this as a pathway to the next general election, isn't perhaps the immediate problem that there isn't something that will perhaps address the cost of living crisis in particular in the short term, in the next 6 months?
I think that's certainly true. We could be in a situation, very soon where we're dealing with rising unemployment, an escalating cost of living crisis, a pretty sharp economic slowdown. We can already see in the data, public confidence in the economy is deteriorating, and public disapproval in how the government is handling inflation is now very, very high. About 75% of all voters think the government is handling inflation badly. So people are feeling it. Now, that could change the entire political agenda. As Ryan says, we are less than 2 years away from the next general election, and that could reassert a lot of the economic issues that were put onto the back foot by Brexit. So that potentially is one of the big risks for facing Johnson and his government.
Ryan Shorthouse, given that elections are often fought on the economy, is the government short-sighted, perhaps not to have, if you like, thrown people a clear sign of what they're going to do about the cost of living crisis? Or should we take Boris Johnson's words that the answer is going to be growth as actually the policy?
Well, I think there's two things here. The first is that the Chancellor obviously wants to use tax cuts as the main tool to help people with the cost of living crisis. So I suspect when we get closer to the autumn, when energy prices hit again because the cap goes up, you might see, for example, cuts to VAT. The problem with relying on tax cuts solely is that it only reaches so far down the income spectrum. A lot of people don't pay tax, national insurance, or income tax, certainly, because they're just on too lower earnings. And the Chancellor seems a little bit allergic to using welfare like universal credit and uprating universal credit to the kind of level that needs to be considering the rate of inflation at the moment. So I think, I think what you're seeing actually is a Chancellor who wants to use tax cuts, but actually that's a problem because it doesn't reach some of the voters that you need to. But I think the broader picture is that actually, I think this Queen's speech indicates a sort of return to bread and butter conservatism. So we want to not spend too much. We want low taxes. We'll focus on things like crime, immigration. I think the Chancellor is almost winning the argument a little bit here, which is actually we're not going to spend, we're going to grow the economy. And that is a conservative approach.
To come back, though, to your earlier point about the government having one last chance to be bold, if you think about the planning reforms and what we were hearing from Nick Eardley, that a lot of these more controversial reforms are going to be thrown out, but reforms which actually MPs and perhaps voters in the north would have appreciated because they want to see more houses built, doesn't that really describe the tension now that sits at the heart of the party?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, this Conservative government has a uniquely impressive majority. And if the government squanders that and doesn't do something bold and radical on levelling up, then it would have wasted that opportunity. Okay. I mean, at the end of the day, I think you remember governments if they give you a new service or a new policy or a new institution, and these so-called left-behind areas, what is it that Boris Johnson's government giving them? Right. And that's really the test for this government, and they haven't yet achieved it.
Ryan Shorthouse, Matthew Goodwin, thank you both very much.